reading of Rynorum Awakening. Prologue. Civilized Space, Sector 13, Universal Year 9107. In the endless void of space, every life on every planet is a miracle. An old saying ran through Eve's mind as she smiled into closed eyes this morn. It was one her father enjoyed, said often by the head sensei here in Atreus, Machi la Valda. Eve knew not if the saying were true, never having left Tanli herself, but she did know there were parts here in Atreus that were no miracle. In fact, far from it. She opened her eyes, feeling the calm waves and water at their most settled state. With her in their little boat was Ven Riddle, her father, fishing the bay as they did every morning. On the row bench beside him was a blue metal mug filled with amber-hued kaffit. She let eyes glide toward blue skies, for they felt drawn there as they often were, dreaming of a life beyond. In the distance, on the shoreline, Tanli parakeets and squalor birds chirped their morning songs, and the first calls of Atrean vendors opening their carts sounded from distant markets. She could see strings of lights coming from the windows of the small port town, with Tanli's star far above them, an hour fresh from the horizon. Her heart felt still, nerves and muscle fibers loose and comforted. The sea was her safe space. She and her father always connected over its beauty. They'd both sit and feel as the morning cold turned to high noon's warmth without tarry. They'd admire the high cliffs and their sparkle under the sun, or they'd watch flocks of tropical birds come and go from the shoreline, listening to the cheeriness of their tunes and flaps of their wings. Today was no different. Eve heard her father take a quiet sip of kaffit and the clink of his metal mug as he set it beside him on the bench. She tugged with her right hand, for her fingers gripped a delicate string tied to a mechanical wheel on the outside of the boat near the water's surface. The string reached down into the sea of June, which were ever so still today. She looked down into the deep blue, sparkling as if the very rays of morning's beauty danced in the water. Ven spoke over the quiet. "Don't lean too far." Eve finished the joke, having heard it many times. "You might fall in." "Hey!" He laughed and he gave her a gentle nudge with his boot, his sea-worn skin shining bright. Already he was burning, though light had only been a short while. Eve thanked On often, for she had her mother's complexion. In all her time on the sea, she never came home stung by the sun like her father. Her mother scolded them often for not using the tarp they could pull over her head to protect them, but father insisted they not use it. Rather, he always told Eve, "If today's my last day, I want nothing more than to spend the morning out here with you, under the sun and on the water." The boat jerked suddenly, and Eve looked to see her father reeling with the fury. She pulled down on her own string, beginning its mechanism of pulling in. Swiftly it was brought in full, the wheel's mechanism turned and turned, then clicked to a finish as it slapped against the side of the boat. Eve was grabbing their homemade fishing net. It was light in the hands, yet strong in frame. Her and her father said little then but the occasional glance. Their eyes said all they needed know. A lifetime of fishing as father and daughter had left them able to sense the other. Eve knew well her father would lean back hard and deep when he felt the fish was right near the surface, and there it was. Ven Riddle yanked back on his fishing rod, tipping hard, nearly sending his trusty mug off the bench. Eve leapt to her feet, dipping the net almost up to her hand's grip. There was a flurry of fighting thrusts from beneath the water. Mist was sent into her face. She struggled to rip the net out. It was a heavy weight, but already in her heart she knew what it meant. "Another gully!" she yelled over the chaos of wrangling. The words echoed all the way to the cliffs that lined the hangar bay on shore. He spoke with glee. "You think so?" "Oh, yeah. I'd not forget the weight of one of these bad boys," Eve answered as finally she lifted the net up and into the boat with the heaping metal thud. A great glob of red-pink fish laid before them. It had a thick and round body, and its tail flapped a metal drumming on the bottom of the boat. Stories say that gullyfish could swim up to 20 knots when in danger or hunting prey. Her father knelt atop it swiftly, pulling the knife out from behind the sheath at his waist. The metal drumming turned ever more frantic. Leaning o'er the fish, her father whispered an old phrase she'd heard thousands of times. "I thank you, Erin, Mother of Nature, for this gift, and I promise you, good gully, your gift shall not be wasted." Eve finished mouthing the words alongside him as he slid the knife down the top of its soft head. She closed her eyes, not able to find it in herself to watch it go. The flapping soon stopped, and Eve opened her eyes once more. Her father rose to his seat and placed the gully in a small water bucket on far side the boat. "All right. Still got your lure?" "Yeah." Eve reached down to the mechanism attached at the boat's end and dehooked her string and lure which dangled into the water. Her father laughed with a slap on the knee. Her face scrounged in annoyance. The lure was gone. His voice spoke casual wisdom. Well, the mother gives and takes, dear. 'Tis only fair the gullies too have eaten a fine breakfast today. With that, their morning of peace and fishing ended. Quickly they returned to the shoreline where Eve's mother and their sea house waited. They'd been in the Riddle family now for 4 generations, almost 175 universal years. While this wasn't the same building as the first, for many were knocked down by the sea, their job was nevertheless the same. Eve's parents, as the last 3 generations of Riddles had, brought off-planet visitors to their desired place in town. But today, as had been now for many years, there were no visitors. Most in Atreus knew those coming would seek out lands like Portolos and Stalarvos, those being Tanlee's greatest island port and the ruined city of Redford Gin, respectively. Evening fell as Eve ducked her way beneath one of the barbaric tusks that made up the fencing outside Atreus. They were from the bay whales that had used to visit the harbor every year at the tail end of Otmore, when the northern waters got too cold. They were slimy and gray, brown, furred and ancient, long and powerful. But those were stories people like to tell, probably started thousands of years ago in the Sector 13. Eve still had never seen a bay whale poke its head above the waters for herself. But today her task was simple and one she'd done time and time again. Yet this week her father had given last week's additives once more. Go to the marshes and fetch some bait from Lady Skate. Ask for the corporal toads again. Tell her the gullies have been loving 'em. She'll want to know that. Got it. Eve had nodded. Her father had ruffled her hair, turned around and sent her out the door away from their sea house. We'll be fishing again by light tomorrow. Her feet had crackled over the smooth stones of the path away from their home. Back before dark, all right. He'd finished, and she'd turned and given one final roll of the eyes. As she'd walked, the red ash scent of always stung her nose, and she knew the culprit yet could do naught about it, for the shoreline of Atreus has long been a dead and foul sort of place, as much of the city was becoming. What was once a green and wondrous land perched between the strategic cliffs of Carn and the Bay of June was turning sludge and slout-like. Pollution poured out from the satrium cache deeper in Atreus, and with each year Eve and her father needed stray farther into the sea to fish as conditions worsened. In the city it were far less visible a thing per se, more so in the folks' hearts, for the street and homes out near the cliffs of Carn were rancid, filled with the worst of folk, those who robbed, killed, and raped. Eve's mother never bade her go that far west in Atreus, those neighborhoods by the cliffs, and she didn't intend to. 20 minutes earlier, Eve had left their small sea house, the docks, as known throughout the city. It was late in the evening as she walked past the guild school of Atul Hall and the Emanastery of the Sense on planet Tanlee. She were not far from the bay, so its wretched sea scent still perpetrated her nose. Off to her right, the fence around the nearby marshes began to form. She took one step, then another down the northern Iltep road, eyeing a strange pair hobbling eastward along the marsh edge. They looked drunken, and the mug of beer sloshing in one's hand and the great stain on the other's shirt, likely of some cheap port wine, showed a night well spent. They crashed into each other in their wobbling, and the man holding the beer tripped over himself. His drink and his body toppled into the husk fence of the marsh. The men broke into a fit of arguing as Eve turned left along the same street, away from their blabbering. She heard the distant creaking of a handheld lantern from one street over, barely audible for the ears. She arrived now in front of a small house. Its roof leaned to the left as if it were exhausted of holding its own weight. From inside, warm light and laughter spilled softly out, and a thin white cloth covered the exposed window. She crouched to her knees, touching now the muddy streets at Atreus' edge. She peeked her head inside, and ignored the need to welt on their wood-ragged door. "Evening, Stillies. Is Milo in?" A sharp flinch of Darla Stills came from the interruption, and her jolly melodic voice soon after. "Oh my, Eve Riddle. I dare say you mustn't sneak up on me like that. I'm much too old for these kinds of jokes. They're going to give me a heart attack one of these days, and I'll make sure they know it was your fault." Eve laughed to herself as the wood-ragged door scratched open, pressing through the slanted angle of their stone roof. After so many years, the corner of the door had filed down smooth. Where once it had been a great effort to pry their entrance, now it took barely more than a shoulder. Milo's mum, Darla, poked her head around the door, candlelight shining orange on her face from the window at which Eve had just spoken. "You just missed him, dear. He said he was leaving for your place. Why don't you come in for some dinner? He's bound to return." Eve rose to her feet from that crouch near the window of the Stills' home, a smile already forming on her lips, one she did her best to conceal from Milo's mother. "Thanks, but I think I'll see if I can catch him. We can't play cat and mouse all night without running into each other." With that, she was off, beginning a swiftly paced stride back towards the bay. This time she went through the heart of Atreus instead of along the marshes of Iltep, where the old spirits reside. Eve raced along the streets, her heart excited with the chance to stroll through downtown's most chaos. She feared but was altogether thrilled by the place, like the sensation of looking down from a great height. She felt the dirt road squishing slightly beneath her shoes as a sensory man and woman walked past. They looked a fit in their own conversation, enveloped by their own senses, but altogether they felt as if a force one could not. She flinched out of thought as one of the sensory, a burly woman with buzzed hair and a sharp brow above sensoric eyes, turned to face. She felt as if the woman bore through her body simply with a stare, but still Eve grinned to herself in a strange elation of fear. The woman turned and walked towards the guild hall once again, speaking with her acquaintance. Eve found that she had stopped in place upon the street, watching her as if rooted to the dirt. It was then her spine felt a shiver nearby the husks, one she'd not soon shake. She flicked towards the high-strung fence over the buildings, feeling that a dreaded gray came from deep within the marshes, a place that she'd grown to love, even that strange lady Skade Aisha. Everyone calls her witch, but she does seem rather simple in her own sort of way. In fact, I do think I understand her now, living so far away from Atreus like that. She seemed to see what Father had when he stopped me fishing on my own 3 years ago. I had not known it then, but since the coastal waters have grown more perilous with each jubilee. "Tenley is growing restless," he'd say to Mum when they'd argue in their room. "More restless than the stories told in the times of Captain Tanber." But Mum would not have it, saying, "Oh, stop it, dear. Eve'll never want to take o'er the sea house if you keep talking like this." A flicker of familiarity in the distance pulled Eve out of her thoughts. She saw ahead, walking rather slowly and peeking into tavern windows for drinks of his own, was Milo Stills. She watched him in his foolish display, only a year older than herself, yet far less reserved, as were all the Stills. Eve called out over the distance of Atreus' grimy streets. A few folk turned their heads to watch her run past. "Milo Stills, you'll not be making trouble outside me tavern." She closed the distance quickly, mimicking the old man that owned June's. "Get, boy! Get out of here!" Milo had flinched from the wooden crate he'd stood on, falling in a comical heap to the dirt and mud. Eve laughed as she arrived over him, reaching with a hand for him to grab and rise with. He was a small and scrawny boy with dirty blonde hair and a feverish grin that never seemed to fade. Today he wore bland blue and green garments common in the sea town of Atreus, and upon his feet thick marsh cat boots that he'd fashioned himself over 4 years ago. "What was that for?" He ruffled the fit of his clothing annoyedly. Eve slugged him on the arm, already making way for the marsh errand her dad had given her. "That was for your attention. Come with me." She beckoned. He did not budge, parroting. "What for?" "My father asked for more carpal toads." She ended the words as if hoping to tease an outcome out of Milo. "Already? Didn't we go just last week?" He grimaced with remembrance. Eve nodded with warm playfulness to her words. "We? Oh, right. I seem to have forgotten you not joining me last week. How foolish of me." He glared a moment in jest as she pressed on. "And we're going back because my father and I have been pulling in almost 2 gullies a day with these carpal toads. The bayfish love 'em, and the downtown markets love 'em, so we love 'em too." They turned from downtown, taking a small alley that went behind Milo's home. Not even 5 minutes later, they neared the entrance to the Witch's Road, as nicknamed in town. She could hear Milo fiddling with the small knife he kept. It flicked and fawned about his fingers, along the back of his palms and round front again. Upon arrival at the tusk fence, and as Eve glanced up at its height, she heard Milo stop the knife's steady flick. She reached up, instinctually touching at one of the knots in her hair. It didn't adjust it in the slightest, but all the same she couldn't help herself from the motion in times of stress. In front of them, on both right and left, the whale tusks ended, curling over top to meet in an arch above them, near 30 feet tall in their grandeur. Eve drifted again to disbelief of the old beasts, thought to be over 300 feet in length and many thousands of pounds. How they'd managed to kill a beast like that even in the bloom of space boggled her mind. She stepped past the fence and into the fog. Milo's voice came from behind her. Are you sure no one else can get your dad these carpal toads? Of course not, she called back. Where would be the fun in that? With the final wavering breath, she heard Milo muttering as he scurried through the thick fog. He cut her out of the daze. I don't know how you ever did this trek without me. This place gives me the creeps. Feels like I can hardly breathe this fog. Eve scoffed, taking another step into the marshes, and it seemed as she went as if the fog wrapped around her wake. Oh, don't be a baby. They're all just stories, so we don't come here and get lost as kids. He followed Eve a few paces behind, their feet wandering slow and wary below, not even visible as that were the fog's thickest point upon the very ground itself. You sure it's not so we don't get lost here at any age? I'm not feeling too sure of my surroundings. How do you know we're going the right way anyway? She stopped and faced him, feeling that the curls of her black hair were pulled too tight on her head today, like her mother always kept. Her eyes felt especially sharp then, as if aided by the full moon's light, but her tone came plaintive. It's like I said, I can feel where she lives, where her house is. Even now I can feel soft water rippling off the moss upon the walls, small birds in their nest atop the crook of a roof. I can watch the path outside as a small creature goes scampering over it, and I can hear the little patter of its feet. All right, I get it. Show off, Milo cut in, patting her on the shoulder, voice singing a chord of sarcastic weight. She pushed him gently, and his foot slipped into a shallow pool of the swamp before dropping into even deeper mud. Fuck! Eve! Milo scurried onto drier dirt, crouched and took off his marsh cat boots. The smooth fur was already soaking through with bilge water of the swamps. He looked at Eve with eyes that asked for the apology she rapidly gave. Yet in the distance she heard a voice call then, shrill and high-pitched, but surely it carried the tune of a song. She rose to attention without further addressing of the look he'd given. Silence fell throughout the marshes, as if all other creatures had heard the voice too. She spoke softly, feeling water rush against her shins as she searched around. Did you hear that? Milo was crouched down, slipping on his boots, after tipping them over and dumping out a pitiful splash of water. Hear what? Again the voice came, this time more pure, and Eve could place it was a woman's voice singing a song of the marshes, but in the tongue of an alien it seemed. All the same, it felt as if she'd heard it many times before. Eve guessed it must have been the age-old tongue of a Chaxi or Bragas, the tongue of the Sensorai or the Brixum. She could not make out the words, but the sound seemed to move along the path before them, going from ever distant to slowly too close. Eve's heart began to race as the song grew clearer and clearer in her ears. Again she questioned, this time poking at Milo's back. Please tell me you hear it now. Eve, what are you talking? His voice cut short, and she heard his movement freeze with it. Wait. A woman. Singing. Eve went giddy. Yes! Where from? She turned her head to see his eyes had grown wide and his head tilted slightly to the side as if craning for sound. Milo was ghastly pale, and his gaze focused on something behind her. From that, I think. She turned around and found they were no longer on the winding path through the marshes, but deep in the thick of the trees and fog. What the She felt her feet go wet, and glanced down to see them sunken in the swamp, its murky liquid nearly up to her knees. Milo stood right beside her, yet he felt as if a million miles away, distant beyond touch, there, but never truly there. Eve heard a bass pulsing buzz from over her left shoulder. She whipped around. Before her, the fog in the marshes seemed to warp and bend, as if the air was about to crack. The booming bass pulse whirred and warped. It was so deep Eve felt as if her eardrums would burst. As the low hum grew and the pressure built in her ears, she looked back again and saw that Milo was already crouching in the knee-high swamp water, gripping at blood-running ears. His lips were moving, and the eyes utterly frantic, but no sound seemed to come from his throat. Maybe it's that no sound hits my mind. Eve felt her heart race as Milo's mouth stopped moving, and finally he leapt to his feet, stepping one foot toward Eve in the deep muck. She felt the water's sound vibrating against her leg, as if the sense translated it. He gripped her shoulders and whipped her to face the warping behind. Her breath caught, and did not return for a long while. Before her it looked as if the gates of darkness and evil had split open, as if an underworld of nothingness and demons lay beyond, and had found a path to this place, in this corner of 10 Li. It was a large sort of rip in the air, nearly 20 feet high and 10 feet wide. The trees surrounding had not moved and the water were unaffected, but nothing seemed to penetrate that gate. It was as if the cold black of space had found its way onto Tanley's surface, the darkness of the void itself. Out of that great crack in reality, slow oozing gray smoke spilled out. It hovered over the white fog of the marshes like thick weightless oil and floated over its murky waters. The rip in the black oil smoke seemed so deep and lifeless upon the nature that even the muck of the swamp looked full of life in comparison. From the depths of nothingness that had cracked into existence, that same low-bass warble resonated through Eve's body. She felt a hand gripping on her arm and looked over to see Milo staring into the gate, with eyes glazed in terror. She turned to face the rip once again and flinched, for in that terrible void gate there was now two burning white eyes staring back at her. There was no form holding them up, no silhouette that paired with them, yet those awful white eyes felt as if they watched all things, had waited for time unfound. They seemed to call out to her mind, beckoning she walk into that terrible other. They seemed as if they could sear through her skin with the white-hot intensity if they dared. Finally, Eve closed her own eyes, breaking stare with that rip and that terrible beckoning. Her breath came and went, and her heartbeat was heavy and wait for the torturous space to fade. The seconds were agonizing, but the fade never came. She opened her eyes, and only then, as if on cue, the bass noise disappeared, and all matter of sound rushed into her ears once again. An overwhelming rush of life. She went from utter silence to the chirpings of insects, cricks, and croaks of the marsh togs, and even the creaking of the trees as they swayed in the water. She glanced toward the gate, curious to lay eyes upon that sliver of nothing again. Yet, as if they'd never stepped away, the marsh paths lay beneath them, and their feet were well dry. Milo's ears had no blood dripping, yet he stared at her with the same fear-riddled confusion she felt rising inside. Eve. What the fuck was that? For the first time in her long and sassy life, Eve Riddle knew very well there was only 3 words for such an experience. I don't know.